Let's talk a little bit more about money. You're talking about money here.
Yes,
and
right.
I think this is part of that conversation too. So, as much as college athletics has changed, we're getting into the revenue sharing era this summer. NIL's been part of this thing. Do you think, Sam, that the way that college athletics is going financially is benefiting Nebraska? So, like, in general, where the athletic department stood, maybe you can use the Director's Cup or whatever as sort of a litmus test, where they stood a few years ago to where they stand right now. Are they in a better place because of their ability to leverage financial resources and maybe rise these programs up in a way that they couldn't even a few years ago? Are they more competitive nationally, generally speaking, because of the way things are going economically?
Well, that's a great question. As part of this project I'm doing, one of the breakouts I have is football salaries, how much the coaches are making. And I have 10 so far. 10 coaches' salaries so far. Nebraska, out of that group, talking head coach and assistant coach, 2023 to 2024. Out of the group, Nebraska had the second lowest, ahead of only Maryland. Illinois makes 15,136,621. Minnesota's 15.8 million. Rutgers is 17. You want to know what Ohio State is? Ohio State, the national champion, $28.5 million to coaches' salaries. Football, just football. $54 million for the whole suite of sports at Ohio State. Penn State, which made the playoff, $21 million. Nebraska is at $12,942,893. So, and I'm not saying you need to pay $20 million to win to make the CFP, because there were teams that didn't have anywhere near that and they made it, including Indiana, SMU, one-offs, maybe. But I think there's something to be said for, like, you're going into a rarefied air, and that rarefied air is going to be Nebraska's going to have to compete, be very thoughtful and strategic about how they attack that, Evan. And some of it is cost of living. You know, there's some places in the country where the cost of living is higher, so the expenses are greater. But, you know, Nebraska has always been, to its credit, an athletic department that spends on all the sports. And that's going to be interesting to watch, kind of like going forward, you know. Like, it'll just be now, of the schools that I've looked at so far, Nebraska's baseball team spends the most.
I would say that is a program that has benefited from the way things are going, yes.
So, of the schools that I've looked at, the baseball program that spends the least, and this will be not remotely surprising to you, is Minnesota, which spends $2 million less than Nebraska. And Nebraska spends $4.5 million. Minnesota spends $2.5 million. And that won't surprise you, because Minnesota's pretty bad.
They've been bad for a while
at this point. Second place in terms of the schools that I've looked at for baseball spending, just behind Nebraska, is Washington, coming in the league. We don't get USC's because they're a private school. We won't know. But UCLA I got just today, and I haven't inputted it yet. So, we'll look at the numbers, and we'll kind of look at it. Nebraska, far and away, spends the most on volleyball. They spent $5.9 million on the volleyball team. The team also made $7.2 million, which is a huge record. No one's even close to that. Penn State volleyball made, in terms of revenue, $1.2 million. They just won the national championship. So you don't need to spend or make money. You don't need to spend an ungodly amount to win a volleyball national title. Although Penn State spent $3.5 million, they spent a lot of money, but they didn't spend Nebraska money. There's a lot of different ways to look at that, a lot of different ways to parse it out.
The coach's salary thing is interesting to me, because I think there was this thought that as NIL's gone up and we enter rev share, that coaches' salaries would come down, and a lot of that money would turn toward the athletes, the prospects that are coming in. And then you see Penn State going out and getting Jim Knowles for more than $3 million.
That's right.
For next season. And I don't know, like that got my attention because, again, like you just kind of felt, okay, maybe there's finally a cap on some of these coaches' salaries. And then they go out and they do that. So I don't know if that's sort of specific to Penn State and its view that next year is its year to make a run, or if that's just the continuing sort of inflation, ballooning of finances in college sports right now, or just specific to football and how much ahead of the pack that sport is becoming, within the NCAA. It's that, I don't know, that got my attention as something that was kind of bucking the trend.
We need to look at what happens in basketball. Ohio State is obviously an interesting situation because I feel like Ohio State made sort of a conscious, when they fired Holtman, they were like, listen, we're gonna promote from within. We have other priorities, and they're a nice team this year, but they're not elite. And I just wonder if Ohio State is basically consciously saying, we're going to go ahead and turn the page on emphasizing that, and maybe we'll care about hockey or something else, but it'll be interesting to watch. Nebraska's salary should go up this year. Obviously, Matt Rule's going to make more, but Barthel and Dvorak are probably going to end up making more money than they were making. So Nebraska had multiple bargain coaches on its staff last year. Barthel, Dvorak, and then Garrett McGuire.
Does your numbers on Nebraska coaches include like support personnel? Because I think that was the other thing that Nebraska did was they invested more in that, maybe at the expense a little bit of the coaches' salaries.
That's a separate category, and we're gonna list that out too. The support staff spending went up, and so they did do more in the time that Rule was there, and we may see that they've done even more. I can tell you that Ohio State's spending just fine in that category. And so, like, again, what you have to think of is if you're a Nebraska football fan, and I don't have Iowa's yet, is what's Nebraska's goal? Well, the goal is to make the CFP. And now you can say legitimately, Evan, if you make it, you could potentially win it. How do we know? Because Notre Dame and Ohio State were 7-8. They were not.
Wow, yeah.
And I know it's a kind of a screwy system, but Ohio State legitimately lost 2 games. They weren't going to be. And we watched Nebraska and Ohio State play on the same football field, like we did. And I know that Ohio State wasn't motivated or whatever. Who cares what their feelings were? The reality is Nebraska could have won that game and maybe should have won it. And won many facets of the game. The thing that Nebraska didn't win was they didn't have Ohio State's receivers.
That's right.
And the other thing they didn't have is they didn't get a couple of calls that I thought went against Nebraska on the Jamal Banks catch that was waved off and the Nayor catch that was waved off. And so, like, and I'm not trying to make excuses for Nebraska in that game. They had their chances. Although Nebraska's failure on the goal line certainly looked different at the end of the season, didn't it? Because I think at the time I thought just another Nebraska screw up. I've seen this 100 times. The reality is Ohio State had maybe
historically good red zone defense.
And so it looked different at the end of the year. We're like, oh, that was a function of how good Ohio State was. That wasn't Nebraska. That wasn't Jaquez Yant at Minnesota. And I thought for a second, it's like, Jock Yant all over again. But it wasn't. It wasn't. It wasn't that. It was Ohio State was great, And or whatever happened at Minnesota last year when Gabe Ervin was in, but they didn't call it, and then they had this weird rollout pass. It was, And Tom went, oh. And he threw an interception 1 second later. So, yeah, I mean, like, if your goal is to make the CFP, so you wrote this incredible story about what it takes to be a regional host. And maybe we talk about that next week because it'll be a baseball preview. But, like, what does it take to be a CFP team? We'll do kind of a financial profile of that. The reality is, I don't think Nebraska's that far off. And I think revenue sharing, which we won't really have a number on until, 2 years from now, Nebraska will do just fine there.
One last thing on the CFP. I'll be curious. Like, it's interesting to say, yeah, you get in, you can win. To me, the system's equally set up to say, hey, now your juggernauts have a mulligan or two, and they can still get in and dominate, right? Like that was what Ohio State was. Like in the old system, they would have lost 2 games and been a disappointment, and maybe they would have moved on from their head coach.
Yeah.
And instead, they get a mulligan, and they come in, and they still have probably the most talented roster in college football, and they won the thing. So, so I'll just be curious to see if this actually does, in 12-team era, open the door for underdogs to make a run, or if it actually just makes the sport more top-heavy, because the teams like Alabama and Georgia or whoever can still lose a game or two and get in and flex their muscles. So we'll see how that goes.
Ohio State had a harder schedule too, though. We have to concede that. I mean, they had to go to Oregon. They had to go to Penn State. They beat Penn State. They lost to Oregon by 1. They hammered Indiana, and they lost to Michigan. You know, if they'd beaten Michigan, they would have been the 5 seed, and it would have still ended up being the same damn thing. They would have played Oregon in the semifinals instead, and they would have kicked their butt. But you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Like it wouldn't have changed anything. But like, I get it. Like they had. That's fair. I still think there's going to be more parity, and you are going to see a Notre Dame type team emerge. That was not one of the great teams in CFP history. No. I mean, the quarterback play was not good, but they played so hard and so well and all the other things, and so like I think Nebraska can take inspiration from that. I really do.